Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Talking about amphibians today. A real fun one. A couple quick notes. A couple things we forgot to mention. One thing to clear up my guest afterwards. Love scientists. Listen to this, guys. He was in his head. Asked how many amphibian species there were in the world. He thinks he might have mentioned 8,000. Wrote me afterwards, said the estimates. Probably more like 6,000. This is why I love scientists, guys. My brain will just run away with anything. They're cautious, specific people that value accuracy. If you hear me in future episodes, like telling another guest how many amphibian species there are, I promise you, my subconscious, I'm gonna throw a little razzle dazzle on there. I'm gonna say like 9,000. I might bump it up to like 16,000 amphibian species on Earth, but gotta know, accurate number around 6,000. All right. So second, more importantly, we forgot to mention that they are holding at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville the first global amphibian and reptile and disease conference in Knoxville, August 4 through 10. Links in the bio and on YouTube, etc. There's also a Twitter, GARD 2022 that you can go to. I put them under if you follow me on Twitter, if you go on my list, I have all of my past guests on there if you ever want to see what my guests are tweeting about. Usually it's stuff way more interesting than anything I bog myself down with tweeting about. And so guys, it's, you hear something like first global amphibian, reptile, and disease conference, and a lot of people are just simply not going to be interested. You're probably not going to need to rush to get tickets. You go out on the street, you ask the average person something that they would like to learn more about, or one of their biggest interests in life, probably reptile disease isn't going to show up on there. And what's special about this show is I always get the opportunity to hear about amazing things I would have had no idea that could possibly be so interesting, could possibly say so much about also the human experience in the world, but more generally. This isn't a clickbait podcast. I don't do episodes about whatever drama was going on with someone wearing this and that on whatever red carpet. It's not, we don't do the kind of general gossip or like the political feuding of like what politician is doing this for the midterm. And you listen to this and you go, oh my gosh, now I know something. I got to hear about lizards. I got to hear about ecosystems. I got to hear about things that I wouldn't have known would actually impact my life. And I could have instead been spending all of that time watching cable news or getting myself worked up about whatever the fad of the day is that's circulating around. That's just the most important issue that everyone needs to talk about around the water cooler. And so things like this might just surprise you. So check it out if you want. You happen to be in Knoxville, but either way, you're going to really enjoy this episode. Who doesn't want to hear about critters that can just regenerate limbs and all sorts of weird kind of ways of living that are seemingly so foreign to the human experience, but something that also does impact us, things that we can have as pets, stuff like that. Really cool episode. So enjoy.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. We have once again kind of brought to you by the One Health Initiative. We have another terrific guest from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Professor of Wetland and Disease Ecology, Matt Gray, is joining us today. Matt, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm terrific. So can you, I always like to, just because if I try to, do you ever go to see someone presented to give a talk and someone reads their entire bio and it sounds very contrived and they're screwing up things and I avoid that by just having my guests introduce themselves to me and the audience. So why don't you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Matt Gray, and I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee. I'm the associate director of the Center for Wildlife Health here, and I also lead the Amphibian Disease Laboratory. I've been at UT since 2004, so go Rocky Top. Prior to UT, I grew up in Michigan, and I went to Michigan State, did my bachelor's there, and then came down to the South to the SEC, went to Mississippi State for my master's. Spent a couple of years down in Puerto Rico, hanging out on the beach and studying wetland ecology and amphibians, and then I went out to the high plains of Texas, where there were very few trees and very few hills, and studied amphibians out in the Playa Lake wetlands out there in a very different landscape for my PhD. My area of expertise is wetland systems and also amphibian diseases.
So you were in Costa Rica on the beach and you were just so passionate about your work that you're like, I'm going to get out of here and pursue my research elsewhere. There wasn't stuff to keep you in Costa Rica, huh?
Yeah. So it was Puerto Rico.
Oh, Puerto Rico. Sorry.
Yeah, Puerto Rico. Yeah, but regardless, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, living on the beach. It was pretty nice. I was ready to, after a couple of years, move on and start working on my PhD, and the opportunity in Texas came open. But
I ask because I'm friends with you probably know Robert Trivers. As he does work with lizards, but he went to Jamaica as an undergrad or something and was just like, I just like Jamaica. I guess I'm just going to stay here for the rest of my life.
There's something about island life. I'm a big Jimmy Buffett fan, so living on the beach was pretty natural for me. And I grew up in Michigan on the water. I mean, there's water everywhere. Obviously the Great Lakes, but there's all these inland lakes. And so living on the beach in Puerto Rico is pretty sweet. And people are great. Food is great. It was tough. My hair went from about this length to maybe your length. I don't know, but ponytail in the back and everything. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I'd really like to start off by kind of just doing could we do a little amphibian 101 stuff, some amphibian appreciation chat for a little while, and then kind of talk about some of the bigger picture ecology issues and those sorts of things. The way this show is incredibly unstructured, and I end up going off on a million tangents and just letting the conversation flow. So, but that's kind of the format that I have in my mind. So let's hear first off, what got you interested in amphibians in the first place?
So for my PhD, I studied amphibians, and I was really interested at that time. My focus started to expand into conservation biology, and I was interested in how humans may impact just wildlife populations on the landscape. And as I mentioned, did my PhD out in Texas, and there's these lakes out there called playa wetlands. And they literally will have thousands upon thousands of amphibians that will come down and breed explosively. The amphibians out there, these wetlands dry up every year. And so it's very dry, only about 17 inches of rain per year. And the amphibians live underground. And when they get these kind of monsoonal, just massive thunderstorms that happen in West Texas, where it rains like 3 inches or so, it'll fill up the wetlands and it'll bring them right out of the ground, and they come down, and it's just an amazing biological event to observe. And so anyways, that really, once I did my PhD with amphibians, I knew I wanted to continue studying them. I came to Tennessee, and one of the first projects I did was looking at amphibian use of cattle ponds here in Tennessee. We don't have a lot of wetlands that have standing water. We have lots of streams and seeps and things like that. But as far as kind of flat wetlands, kind of bowl type wetlands, we don't have many except for farm ponds. So I looked at the interaction of cattle and amphibians, and that's when actually we discovered a pathogen that was infecting amphibians here called ranavirus, and started to expand my interest into the disease world, which we can talk about later. But as far as amphibians and how kind of, I guess, cool they are, they are these. Really,
what? First of all, what is an amphibian?
Right.
Let's just get down to the start from the basics.
Okay, yeah. So most people think of amphibians probably as having this tadpole stage. They go from an egg, and then they develop into a tadpole, and then they go through this miraculous process of metamorphosis, and they become this terrestrial adult. And that's kind of called the typical life form or life cycle of amphibians. But there are many other different ways that they survive and reproduce. And so some amphibians actually will lay eggs and underneath of eggs, and the tadpole develops within the egg, and then it hatches as a metamorph. Does not even need to be laid in the water or anything.
Wait, did you say they lay eggs under eggs?
So they'll lay eggs underneath of like leaves and rocks and
I see.
Underground and things like that. And so the tadpole itself will develop within the egg, and then they'll hatch out. It's called direct development. So instead of having that tadpole stage that everybody's so kind of familiar with, they skip that stage. And so that allows some amphibians to be completely terrestrial and not be around permanent water. In fact, many of the salamander species that we have here, close to here in the Smokies, have direct development. But there are other ones that will, some amphibians will carry their eggs around with them. They'll defend them. There are some that will actually eat their eggs, and it'll develop like in their vocal sac or in their stomach, and then they'll end up spitting out live amphibians later. And so there's just really a variety. They're just really cool from that perspective, kind of for just being biological organisms. And so
I can't imagine just puking out like hundreds of little babies.
Right.
That's amazing.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't sound like a fun process. But amphibians have been on the planet. They're the first terrestrial vertebrates that evolved. So over 300 million years ago, they've been around for a long time. They've had a lot of evolutionary history to develop all of these different strategies for reproduction and survival, etc. They've lasted through multiple mass extinction events, including, whatever was the demise of the dinosaurs, so they survived through the era of the dinosaurs. After, they're still here with us. And so they really have a ton of evolutionary history and actually within their DNA and their bodies, they have a tremendous amount of information that we can potentially learn about animals here, or even potentially use to the advantage of humans and human health. And we can talk a little bit about the biomedical benefits of amphibians here in a little bit if you want. But
I would love to.
Really cool organisms.
Well, it's amazing to hear how to think about how resilient they've been, because they do seem like pretty fragile creatures in a lot of ways. It seems like the conditions that a given species needs is probably incredibly fragile. I mean, just the idea of counting on. I lived in Austin, Texas for a couple of years, and I'm familiar with the storms, but just the idea of waiting around for a storm to happen, or taking advantage of a cattle pond that wouldn't have existed through much of Earth's history in that particular kind of a man-made thing that they're able to thrive in. Are they using are amphibians using kind of a numbers game situation more than a lot of species, where you're puking out a bunch of 1,000 babies at a time or whatever, and hoping that enough survive, or just kind of putting a lot of eggs in a lot of different baskets? Or how are they able to have survived for so long?
Yeah, so the reproductive strategies of amphibians range from producing lots, laying thousands upon thousands of eggs and hoping that a couple survive to the next generation, to actually laying very few, and usually with those species, a lot of which are located in the tropics, in more stable environments, the parents are taking care of the eggs. So there's a lot of parental care, and they may only have 10 eggs. And so, in biology, we call it R versus K selected species. And that range of reproduction from just producing a few and taking care of them and trying to get them to the next generation, kind of like we do as humans, which would be K selected, and then R selected, which is they reproduce a lot, and they produce lots of eggs, and it's a numbers game. So, go ahead.
I'm curious, in the case selected amphibians, where there's more parental investment, is there any paternal care at all in those species? They given any Father's Day cards out in those species?
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And often it is the male that's taking care of the eggs. Yeah.
Interesting.
There's a species that is actually in Europe called the midwife's toad, midwife's toad. And they carry them around on their back, the eggs, until they're ready to hatch. And so it's a pretty, again, there's a variety of ways and strategies that amphibians reproduce, and you can see that diversity across the entire group of animals.
That's interesting, because kind of going back to I mentioned Robert Trivers, and one of his big contributions is this idea of minimal parental investment theory, and kind of the gender that has the most cost in investing in the offspring is typically the most selective and choosiest of a potential mate. And there's been a lot of advances since those early ideas that he had, but that was kind of the early basics of it. And some of the exceptions that proved the rule were things like seahorses, where males would the female would kind of insert the eggs into the males, and so kind of some of the selection behavior was seemingly reversed. But I was it is my understanding that you see that quite a bit more in freshwater species, where you'll see a lot more of males carrying a lot of the eggs to fruition, more than you would see in other species.
Yeah, that trend may be true, but I can let you know, as far as amphibians, pretty much they are all freshwater species associated with freshwater systems. There are a couple that can withstand, some brackish conditions, but most amphibians need fresh water.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about their physiology that kind of makes them susceptible to environmental change. So you're kind of made a comment before about, how have they lasted so long and they take advantage of different things. Well, things were different, have been different over, millions and millions of years, until, of course, now we have humans that are changing the environmental conditions at very rapid rates.
Right.
And one thing that amphibians, all amphibians have, is they have permeable skin. Some is their skin's more permeable than others, but they can. So through their skin, they can absorb chemicals. They can actually take up water, and because of those conditions, number one, they can't live in a saline environment, but number two, they're also very susceptible to environmental change that could be chemical in nature, or change that could reduce moisture or humidity conditions around them. Because if their skin doesn't remain moist and dry, or moist, they'll end up desiccating, they'll dry out. And so it's a constant battle with amphibians to try to maintain a moist skin. And we have, I know we started off the discussion about, talking about amphibians in very dry areas like West Texas or the desert Southwest, like the Sonoran Desert. There are amphibians. Now, how do they even survive in those environments? Well, they escape it by burrowing under the ground, keeping their skin moist, and they'll even shed mucus and skin and kind of encapsulate themselves within like a cocoon that keeps their skin moist. So it's a constant struggle for amphibians to always be, they have to keep their skin very moist. And so that's one of the things when it comes to, humans impacting amphibians. Obviously, if we apply chemicals to the landscape, which we often do in agriculture, we have chemicals that come out of the effluent of our sewer, sanitary sewer systems that go into waterways. We have chemicals that are actually attached to water molecules that are falling from the sky. And then
man, I forgot about the chemicals falling from the sky part. I was ready for everything else today, and I forgot about the chemicals falling from the sky. Gosh darn it.
Yeah, I'm more in tune to following water chemistry now that I have a pool than I ever have before, because after a rainfall, it messes up the water chemistry in my pool all the time.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, amphibians, although they have this miraculous history of as a terrestrial vertebrate, of 300 plus million years, they're declining more than any other group of terrestrial vertebrates on Earth. And so it's been estimated, that about 35 to 40% of amphibians are in threat of extinction, and over 50%
can you repeat that?
Yeah, 35 to 40% of amphibians are in threat of extinction. And over 50% of species are showing some evidence of declines. And so they are the most imperiled class of vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates that exist.
How many species are there?
So around 8,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is our how prolific are amphibians just around the world? Are they, is there just, you get up north far enough and you don't see amphibians anymore, or what's kind of their limitations?
Yeah. So amphibians exist on every continent in the world, except for Antarctica. And but the majority of species, when it comes to frogs, the majority of species are around the equator. When it comes to salamanders, which is not the other group of amphibians, the majority of those are actually in the temperate region. So some of the highest salamander biodiversity is right here in our back door here in the Smoky Mountains. And there's another group, the Caecilians, which we don't know much about. These are kind of like worm-like amphibians that are also in the tropics. That many of them live underground. So the majority of the diversity is within the tropics, and that's dominated by the frog diversity.
Going back to some of the early origins of amphibians and things kind of starting to crawl out of the water a bit and be some of the early origins of terrestrial life as we know it. Do they have a common descendant, or is this something that has there been a lot of like a convergent evolution? Has this been something that's popped up multiple times independently through evolutionary history?
Yeah, so there's a couple different theories of the historical evolution of amphibians, but the ancient amphibians were really fish that would first, and they were very big. These were huge animals that might be like 6 feet, and they're kind of swimming in the shallows, and then they started to develop limbs that would allow them to push themselves up, and then some started to develop the ability to take oxygen in with lungs, and so eventually these big amphibians, the ancient amphibians, were large, came out of the ground. There were no other terrestrial vertebrates. They came out into a predator-free environment. There was tremendous predatory pressure in the aquatic environment. And so they were able to diversify and evolve within that nice system. And back then, all the continents, were basically around the equator. So it was a nice big swamp back then. And so perfect conditions for amphibians to evolve. And then from there, then a variety of pressures and processes changed the way amphibians look. Once we had the evolution of the dinosaurs, just naturally, the big amphibians got picked off. So you had this natural evolution of amphibians getting smaller and smaller in body size. And of course, once the continents broke up and started to spread across, then you had environmental conditions changing, et cetera, that also added to that diversification over time. And in some situations, you had species that had convergent evolution. So from disparate areas with not even similar phylogenetic relatedness, actually evolving very similar characteristics on opposite sides of the globe. And so
it's like flight, where it's just such a useful thing that any species that stumbles on the ability to do it seems to take off.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
or maybe
back then,
not.
Yeah, well, it takes a while.
Yeah.
But that is the process of exploiting what are called open niches. If you can find out how to survive different than something else, then your genes ultimately are passed on to the next generation, and those traits are propagated over time. And that's what amphibians have been doing for over 30 million years. So you have this very nice, tremendous diversity within the amphibian group that spans all these sorts of life history strategies and also strategies to acquire food and etc. So and to survive, whether it's dry or moist conditions.
And are a lot of amphibians then breathing through their skin?
Yeah, so I mentioned that their skin is semi-permeable, so they can take up water. They can also respire through their skin. All amphibians have that ability to have oxygen pass through. In fact, most amphibians do have lungs. Okay, but there are some amphibians that don't. The most speciose, the most common group of salamander species are in the family Plethodontidae, and that group is called the lungless salamanders. It's believed that they had lungs and then they de-evolved lungs over time because they didn't need them. Most of the plethodontid salamanders are like here in the Smokies, where they're associated with very high oxygenated streams, and so they're able to take up that oxygen through the water. They're in very moist conditions. And so, some don't have lungs and they rely completely on cutaneous respiration. And then there are other species that have lungs that during, for example, hibernation, a real common one would be like the American bullfrog. A lot of them will go to the bottom of a pond and they will hibernate down there. And obviously they can't breathe water. They have lungs, but they'll be continuously respiring during that hibernation process. So, just, again, really kind of cool adaptations that exist within amphibians.
Yeah. What's some of the more bizarre, interesting strategies from your point of view? Because I think a lot of people have seen what is it, the poison dart frog or whatever, this beautiful looking species that I always we sometimes talk on the show about the evolution of different ways of signaling that species have adapted, and I love the idea that something like a poison dart frog, almost, or something that makes itself incredibly colorful, and makes itself stick out as a signal to predators, for predators to see it and be like, too good to be true. I better not. If something's making itself that known, there must be something up here. And then I'm curious if there's any amphibians that then take advantage and mimic that without actually being poisonous. Just copy the visual deterrent once that evolved.
Yeah, right. So the aposematic coloration or warning coloration exists in a lot of different animals across the globe. Amphibians are no exception. So it's warning coloration saying I'm toxic. Now, the interesting thing about the poison dart frogs is that they get their toxins from their diet. So a lot of one of the most common amphibian species in the pet trade are poison dart frogs. They got their name from, indigenous people, actually putting their darts or arrows, cutting it through their skin. And the toxin is so strong that, you could shoot a small animal, a mammal, and kill it. Or a person for that matter. And so, but they get it from their diet. They get it from eating these ants that have this chemical. And so when you have poison dart frogs here in the trade, like for example, in the US, they're eating other things. They're not eating those ants. So they're not toxic, although they have that warning coloration that's on them if they were in the wild. So as far as mimicry is concerned, yes, we see that with a variety of amphibian species. Here in the Smokies, we have a salamander called the imitator salamander. And it imitates a variety of different color morphs of other species, one of which is called the red-cheeked salamander or the Jordan salamander. And that species is very toxic and has red cheeks. So it's a very dark salamander, but then its red cheeks are signaling to a predator, don't mess with me. So an imitator salamander can look to a predator very similar to a red cheek. In hand, there are characteristics that you can tell the difference, but so that signaling happens. And it's just a process of species learning and mimicking and figuring out, hey, that works.
Without having to burden yourself with putting a bunch of energy into making the actual toxin. You can just bluff.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So the species that we have here, like, for example, the Jordan salamander, there's also a lot of folks in North America or the U.S. have seen the eastern newt or the red spotted newt, which is in the eastern U.S. It's very colorful. The juvenile stage is bright red with red spots, and they're very toxic. And then in the western U.S., there are also other newt species like the rough skin newt and some others that are also very toxic. And they all have some sort of coloration generally associated with them to let predators know, don't mess with me. They are they are investing a fair amount of their energy resources to go into producing the glands and the toxins that are there. So it's worth, if you have that investment, if you don't want to, if you're a salamander, getting bit by a raccoon, for example, and then it goes, oh, wow, I tasted something bad and spitting you out. It's still not a good thing. There aren't any salamander hospitals that are out there in the wild, right?
Right.
Right. So, it is, these traits have been picked up through, generations and generations to be able to show that coloration. Like, oh, I'm not going to eat that animal because I know that it tastes bad. I can get sick. And so that's how these things happen over time. And next thing you know, you have these species with these very recognizable patterns.
In terms of, actually, before I get to the next question, what's another one or two strategies out there that usually surprise people when you tell them about it?
Yeah. So I think one of the coolest things about amphibians is their ability to regenerate limbs.
I love the. I just found out recently. I had someone on talking about lizards a few months back, and I loved I knew about a detaching tail that can regenerate. I didn't know that there's a species where they can detach their tail and their tail will go scooting off in a different direction, like a decoy.
That's right. Yeah.
For a predator to chase. Amazing.
Yep. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So the and salamanders also, it won't wiggle around, but like if a predator grabs its tail, it'll detach very easily, so that it just gets the tail. There's not a lot of tissue damage. It heals it heals pretty quickly. But I'm also talking about like literally amputation. And the ability to actually regenerate an entire limb. It's most notable in what's called the Mexican axolotl, which is a species that's often found in the pet trade, and it's used a lot in biomedical research. So there's a lot of work being done. You can imagine if we can figure out how salamanders can actually grow limbs, the biomedical prospects of that, or potentially even repair organs, repair organ damage after heart attack or if, some ailment. It's just amazing. And so what they're able to do is, we all start out as stem cells. And so, you've heard a lot of research in, the biomedical area with stem cells, but, and so just using stem cells to try to fix ailments to go in, because stem cells can become any cell type. Now, what salamanders are able to do that we cannot do is that once our cells become differentiated into skin cells and other types of cells that we have, they can't go back to becoming like a stem cell, but salamander cells can. They can they can relearn, they can be signaled to go back to acting like a stem cell. And so a lot of the research is trying to focus on what is that signaling that occurs, so that you could be able to maybe put something within your body that would signal in these areas of damage how to go back to being a stem cell to repair yourself internally, instead of, a lot of the work, as I mentioned, is just kind of injecting stem cells and hoping that it kind of forms around an area and helps, with tissue regeneration. So that's a really cool thing that I think maybe most folks don't know.
It's amazing.
Amphibians.
I had a couple foot surgeries years ago, and it's by the way, for listeners that have had to hear me tell this story over and over again, it's doing pretty well. It's healed quite a bit, but there's still like lots of scar tissue. I still have some mobility issues and things. And the idea of one day living in a world where we can learn things from amphibians or use stem cells in a way that can treat things like that. I remember years ago having a guest on. It was so long ago, I can't remember all the details very well, but she studied fish hair cells for hearing, and how these hair cells, they get damaged, and in humans they get damaged and we lose hearing over time. In fish, they regenerate, so their hearing can get damaged, but it regenerates their hearing. And how can we use that to potentially address hearing problems in humans? And the idea has stuck with me ever since, because it's incredible to think about. It's like it's a amazing sci-fi movie situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another kind of cool thing about amphibians, we were talking a little bit about toxins and talked about the biomedical aspects of limb regeneration, but so a lot of the toxins that amphibians can produce also have really very strong analgesic capabilities. So they're very potent pain medicines. So some of those chemicals that have been sequestered have the pain stopping ability that is it's, for example, some of the comparisons are over 30 times more potent than morphine. And one cool thing about amphibian, those chemicals associated with amphibian, is that they're not addictive. There are some other side effects that some of the researchers have been working on, that there may be some nausea associated with it, et cetera, but they're not focused on the opioid receptors, or focused on different receptors of pain. And so they don't have that addictive quality.
Wow.
And so really, as a biologist, I hate to taunt the really neat evolutionary capabilities of amphibians and how humans can, capitalize off of them. And so hence we should conserve them. But at the same time, they do have just a tremendous amount of biological information within each of their bodies, evolving over all this time, that really humans can take advantage of that. And if that also helps with their conservation and their and maintaining biodiversity in the wild, then great. Anyways, amphibians are really cool for lots of reasons, including there's lots of human uses potentially for them too.
Yeah, I mean, I know all about pain management and from the foot related issues and things too. So it's that would be and I'm watching the series Dope Sick on Hulu or whatever right now, and so it would be amazing if we keep on innovating better ways of managing pain in humans. There's also, my audience is going to kill me if I don't ask you about the 5-MeO TMT. Are you familiar with the with the various psychedelic properties of amphibians as well? I don't want to put you on the spot here, but when it comes to things like that, that's actually that's another issue, is this things like this 5-MeO DMT. This I think it's a frog in Mexico or something that comes out. You go out at night, and there's ways of cultivating this substance that have traditional use in cultures that are more sustainable than, say, when there becomes some American or European demand for this stuff, and suddenly I've heard of horror stories of kind of people going and just scooping up a ton of these frogs and shipping them in crates around the world, and it leading to population decline and things as well, and that comes from, that's kind of, I believe it's an illegal drug. I believe it's a classed substance. So then what comes along with an illegal trade is usually unsustained, poorly regulated and unsustainable cultivation of it. And so I wanted to ask you about things of that nature. Now, it doesn't need to be that specifically, but then just in terms of sustainable, I'm sure the same can be true of the pet trade industry as well, where I know they're incredible pets. I remember being in grade school and everyone getting a tadpole to take care of or whatever, and having this in class. And I imagine there's plenty of bad actors out there, and then I imagine there's probably I've been to a lot of zoos as well, where they do amazing conservation efforts, and I've seen behind the scenes in zoos that the tremendous amount of hoops that they jump through to take care of like the gourmet chef experience. And if you ever get a chance to go into a kitchen in a zoo, it's incredible. They're always trying to enrich their diets and find new ways of, entertaining and providing better nutrients. There's I think on the Fort Worth Zoo, they do acupuncture on a bunch of mammals because they live so beyond their normal life that their spines start fusing together and stuff. And so there are, and then a lot of the money used in zoos it goes to conservation efforts elsewhere, trying to help preserve endangered species and stuff. And then there's of course bad actors that are involved in the illegal pet trade and things. So could we talk about that topic a little bit?
The drugs or the illegal pet trade?
Choose your own adventure. And my audience is like, drugs.
Now we just
make them talk about the drugs.
We're good. Yeah. So there are a variety of reasons why amphibians are collected from the wild. There may be, some medicinal reasons, and that goes across wildlife trade. There's the illegal wildlife trade industry is estimated at anywhere between $8 and $20 billion annually. So there's and a lot of that are the very large megafauna. Rhinoceros horns and things like that. But that occasionally falls down into amphibians, but to a lesser degree. Most of the amphibian trade that occurs, there aren't any estimates, to be honest with you, as far as illegal. We're trying to get some estimates of, how much of the amphibian trade is illegal. But my feeling is it's probably a fairly small percentage. actually get amphibians into, for example, the United States, it's a fairly easy process, just as long as they aren't listed as a CITES species. So that's a treaty among nations that, that we're basically not collecting animals that are threatened or endangered from other countries and importing them into the U.S. or into other countries. So that animals that are rare are not allowed to be taken from the wild. And so there's a list that that exists for all countries that you can't have these CITES listed species. And so there is probably, some situations where you have CITES listed species that, sometimes the rarer the species, the more people will pay, they are, people are trying to smuggle those in. Probably not too difficult to smuggle in amphibians, right? Whether somebody's bringing them or you just ship them and you declare it as something else. That occurs, but I think for the most part, the amphibian trade industry is composed of really good actors, and we've just completed we've just completed a series of sociological surveys, social science surveys, where we asked amphibian businesses here in the U.S. a bunch of questions, and amphibian consumers, pet consumers, kind of their interest, and one thing that, so just to, first of all, maybe it's a better place to start if we want to talk a little bit about trade, about, how big is amphibian trade? And so in the United States, we import around 4 million live amphibians per year. Okay. Now, that is, I don't know if that means a lot to your listeners or your viewers.
That's 4 million. That's like one amphibian per 100 person, basically, in the United States.
So it's a fair, it's a fair number of animals. To give you an idea, globally, though, the United States comprises 50% of the global market. So we are the number one country importing amphibians across the globe. Most of those amphibians are coming from Southeast Asia region, areas of Western Africa, like around Madagascar, and also down through Central America, like Nicaragua and Panama, and some down into South America. And most of the number one species, ironically, that is imported, your listeners might get a kick out of this, is the American bullfrog. That's right. Yes.
From other countries. Okay.
That's right. And so there used to be, many years ago, there used to be a lot of American bullfrog farms around the United States, or a fair number. And, they would raise bullfrogs, and it would go into the the frog leg market, the food market was the primary use of those. But it wasn't very profitable. Fish hatcheries are much more profitable than raising bullfrogs. And so that industry kind of disappeared, but in lots of other countries around the world, in this hemisphere and on the other side of the world, we exported American bullfrogs and their eggs, and they're raised all over. And so the American bullfrog is one of the largest frog species in the world. They produce like 10,000, 20,000 eggs at a time. You can mass produce them really quickly, and they are a very good protein source. And so we actually eat a lot of bullfrog legs here in the U.S., but most of those animals are actually imported as live, and then they go through production here. So about half of the animals that we import are destined for, so about 2 million animals or so go into really just the food market. But the rest are pets. So, about 1 to 2 million animals per year are being, imported into the pet industry. and from across the globe. And us and the European Union and Japan are the number one importers. And most of the amphibians, again, that are imported into those into the importing countries are not from those areas. So, like I said, most of the imported amphibians are from Southeast Asia, Western Africa, and Central and South America.
So, would you say that? I mean, would you say that it's? What do you think about amphibians as pets? Are they pretty? One, are they pretty easy to keep? Two, is it something that is like fairly ethical compared to, is it certainly compared to like getting some primate species or something like that shipped in? What or everyone's familiar with like the Lion King program that took the world by storm at the beginning of COVID or whatever. In terms of having an odd like exotic-ish pet, where would you what do you think about amphibians?
Yeah, having pet amphibians, I think is a neat hobby. A lot of people really enjoy it. A lot of them are really cool. They are fairly easy to keep. Some are a little more challenging than others. Some are really colorful, and they're also, it's pretty neat to watch them eat. So all amphibians are insectivores, so you can watch them. Watch that predatory action. When you feed them like flies or some other sort of insect. And so, in the legal trade, the amphibians that are imported are not CITES listed. And so they are common, at least currently within the environment. And but one thing I'll also mention is from our recent survey is that of the amphibians sold within the United States, it's only about 10% are imported. About 90% are actually being raised and produced here in the U.S. So these could be species from all over the globe. But what we're seeing as far as imports is that imports are tending to decrease as far as amphibians over time, because there's more and more businesses that are getting into the amphibian production or frog production business for pets. It's a pretty lucrative business. Some frogs, salamanders go for $50, $100 more if it's a really cool species. You even see this in the snake trade too, where folks want certain color patterns, etc. And so one thing that we found from our surveys is with respect to consumers, pet amphibian consumers, is that they are a very well-informed group. Many of them have college degrees. Many of them know a lot about the threats of amphibians. Many of them have conservation interest. And, with people having pets as amphibians, you create a connection, right? And so I think there is a fine line between, just having having animals and taking animals from the wild, or then reproducing them and having them as pets, or just some people don't even think you should have pets, any sort of non-domesticated animal as a pet. And that's fine to have that opinion. But pets create a connection. If you've ever had a pet, whether it's a dog or a fish or maybe a snake or an amphibian, there's a connection there. And because of that connection, people have a greater appreciation for the animal, and are more likely to think about things like wild amphibians and conserving wild populations, whether it's here in the U.S. or abroad. So whether it's folks having amphibians as pets or zoos having amphibians or other animals for people to come and view. It is an educational process that helps people increase their awareness and appreciation for animals in general. And
that's a great point.
That,
I mean, yeah. Sorry.
No, I mean, because of that, I think having captive wildlife that are in a captive wildlife industry is beneficial, and it can help in the process of conservation and conserving biodiversity around the world.
That's a really, really interesting take, because so many of us, aren't living on a ranch, connected with wildlife. And so amphibian is something that you can be in the center of Manhattan and have a pet in a tank, and that connects you and reminds you about nature in ways that you wouldn't normally have a kind of hands-on experience with. That's
Absolutely.
That's interesting. I also, it's interesting to hear that it tends to educate, a lot of educated people tend to, or amphibian owners tend to be educated people. What a wonderful way to advertise your intellect, just to have some some frogs next to your bookcase of science books you've never actually read or whatever. So when company comes over, you get to go, well, look at my brain.
Right.
Very cool. Well, how about before we get into some more ecological issues, I want to go back to the biomedical stuff, because that's fascinating.
Sure.
What things have actually, okay, so amazing, let's get our limbs back and our hearing back, and let's fix my scar tissue and everything else. That's terrific. Look forward to that. But what things have actually already been created from studying and researching amphibians?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I know that where lots of areas of research are being done, but I'd have to look into particular examples of, hey, anybody that takes this, by the way, that's derived, at least initially, from an amphibian.
There's always weird things. I think something with snails was some of the early, what we use for the adhesive and Band-Aids came from snails originally, or something like that. I don't know. So I'm sure there's a bunch of things, but if you don't know, that's fine.
Well, so I don't know if folks know, but there's the African clawed frog. It's in the genus Xenopus. It's these really ancient kind of prehistoric frogs. They're totally aquatic. These are the frogs you often could, see them in a pet store. They've got webbed feet, and they're pink, usually red eyes. And so that species was originally used as one of the first ways that we found out you could test for birth, whether or not somebody was pregnant. A woman was pregnant. So, a hormone that women produce when they are pregnant, we can basically it's in their urine. You could take the urine, you could expose these frogs, female frogs, to it, and they would begin to ovulate. And so
like progesterone or something like that, or do you know? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the hormone, but the and they would ovulate. So the very first pregnancy test that actually existed, frogs were used. Now they have synthetic tests, but so that's kind of just an interesting tidbit of information.
That would be fun to go back to the frog way of doing, instead of waiting for the little markers or whatever. That would be what a nerdy fun way to test if you're pregnant.
Yeah.
I cut you off again, as I tend to do, but continue your thought. You
No,
said because of
that's
that.
all
That's
I
how.
had.
Okay,
I've
cool.
never tried it.
I've never tried it. Okay, so let's get into some of your. Can you talk about your work with the ecological impacts and some of the concerns? I love a good. We've built a wonderful appreciation for amphibians, and now I want to do the later in life David Attenborough, here comes the next great extinction sort of things to be aware of, because I imagine in a lot of ways, because of the sensitivity of the nature of amphibians' living condition and their sensitivity to water and climate. I imagine in certain conditions they're the canary in the coal mine for things like overuse of chemicals and even global warming, leading to increasingly dry conditions and desertification in throughout the globe. So, what is your work regarding wetland and ecology and tying this all together with amphibians?
Yeah. So, as we talked earlier, amphibians are the most imperiled vertebrate class, and there's lots of reasons for that: habitat loss, etc. But one thing that has recently arisen as a cause of amphibian declines and extinctions is disease. And historically, disease as a population regulating factor or a factor in species extinction has been really dismissed in the field of ecology. There was some initial mathematical modeling done back in the 70s that suggested that really, in most situations, disease will not drive a host population to extinction. We now know that's false. So in the 70s, the 1990s, a fungus called the chytrid fungus, Batrachochytrum dendrobatidis, or BD for short, was discovered killing amphibians, killing frogs, in Central America. And then shortly thereafter, we discovered the emergence of BD in other parts of the world. That really turned the ecology world upside down when they realized this was a pathogen never described before. It's killing these animals to where they aren't there anymore, and some species are disappearing. And that's happening in multiple locations, around the world. And, since that initial discovery in the late 90s to now, 20 years later, that pathogen, along with a sister pathogen that's just been discovered called Batrachochytrum salamandrivorans, or BSAL, and another pathogen called ranavirus, have contributed to the decline of over 500 species across the globe. And it's been estimated that there have been approximately 100 species extinctions associated with BD specifically. So we know this now after the development of those initial epidemiological models that in certain conditions, the pathogen itself or the way the host interacts with each other, that if you have a disease or a pathogen and we all congregate together, all right, we're all going to get it. That would be one example of how, and this is it. This is our species in this room right here. We're all going to get it. We're all going to, if it's easily transmissible. And so the thing about chytrid and ranavirus is that both of those pathogens can transmit very easily. And they can, live in the environment or persist in the environment for a certain good amount of duration, a couple of weeks. And the other thing is that amphibians, they come together and they often will breed in groups. And so the host populations will maybe kind of disperse, but then come springtime, for example, here in the temperate US, then they all come together and there's very high contact rates. And that allows that transmission to occur within a population very rapidly. So because of the life history of amphibians and because of the characteristics of the pathogen, we've witnessed, population declines and species extinctions. And those group of amphibian pathogens have really resulted in the greatest biodiversity loss that we've observed in modern history. And it's associated with a disease. So that's kind of a real recent revelation that disease can, really affect populations. Obviously, we just went through a pandemic, so folks are fairly in the general public familiar with how quickly things can transmit, pathogens can transmit, and the potential effects on hosts.
Yeah, I think that one of the big misunderstandings that I've noticed during the pandemic is people kind of writing a lot of this off as just like, oh, we have immune systems, these things just happen, and kind of aren't aware of the novel conditions of our modern environment, the sort of things that the kind of One Health initiative addresses with biodiversity loss, and just kind of becoming aware of things like, viruses and things have been around for 4 billion years, but this is the first time that it was able to, a virus is able to fly around to the other side of the world in less than a day and potentially affect a new population, a population that is, speaking of New York City moments ago, has confined such an insane number of species in terms of humans to such a novel, a uniquely small area that is unlike anything that a human immune system was built in and built for. And I imagine there's a lot of things like that happening in lots of species with biodiversity loss, and probably in amphibians where so amphibians first, going back through evolutionary time, they first come on land and there's this predator-free environment. It's just this oasis of if you can adapt for this condition, the world's your oyster. You have nothing but space to explore and resources to exploit. And now there's, because of human impact and changes in temperature, some of the area that many species are able to live in is shrinking, and that shrinking of that is creating more and more confinement within species, which is a dream scenario for a lot of disease and bacteria and viruses to want to spread to more hosts. So if you pack a bunch of hosts together, it's going to take off and be able to replicate and spread a lot more.
Yeah. So you touched on two things that are some of the primary causes for emerging infectious diseases, whether it's humans or animals, frogs. And that is, number one is that there are pathogens when it comes to wildlife that evolved with their host on the other side of the world. Mm-hmm. But the amphibians over here in North America, or vice versa, have not been exposed to those pathogens, or they've been exposed to a quite different strain or variant of it. And so the effects on the host are pretty severe. and unless until most of the population could die, or maybe there's a few that have resistance, and then that's all that's left if they can find each other to reproduce. And then you would have this natural evolution or selection towards those individuals with that immunity. So one thing that has changed is that, through global trade, globalization, et cetera, we're moving pathogens. Humans are moving pathogens around ourselves if we're coughing on each other, but also through our trade processes. The amphibians can be imported into the U.S., and they could have micro pathogens on them. And there are no regulations here in the United States, and actually most countries, when it comes to the importation or the trade of wildlife internationally. There are not animal health requirements. There are for domesticated animals, there are for aquaculture species, but for wildlife, they do not need to have what's called an animal health certificate. So those sorts of processes and requirements exist internationally through the World Organization of Animal Health. And there are certain pathogens that if you're trading domesticated wildlife, that you have to prove these animals do not have these pathogens to be imported into a country. That does not exist for wildlife. There's no regulatory requirement. So again, whether it's a mammal or a bird or a frog that's going from one country to another, it's the floodgates are wide open as far as moving these animals and their microbes coming with them. So that is certainly, without a question, one of the reasons how chytrid got around the world, and it believed that it evolved in Southeast Asia over time, and that it was disseminated across the globe through trade. And so that's one thing. One is the movement of pathogens, the global translocation of pathogens. The second is evolution. So when you have really high contact rates among a host species like you're talking about, the pathogen itself will often have will have more opportunities to mutate, to change, and to evolve into something that can be hypervirulent. And in trade, often animals are in high densities, and if you have animals even that come together from different parts of the world, they could have, for example, the one virus I mentioned, ranavirus. There could be different species of ranavirus that are similar enough they can infect the same host cell. They can be in there, and they can actually swap DNA and result in rapid evolution. But also, viruses, as how many? Well, I'm not even sure what variant we are on with COVID now. They evolve so quickly that just through the natural DNA replication process, there's all these errors that can occur, that things some of those errors don't do anything. And then some of them, all of a sudden, our immune system's like, what is this? It doesn't recognize it. Mm-hmm. And so the process of high contact rates that you mentioned a bit ago in captive animals, when you have animals that are infected or animals from different areas with different strains, can result in the evolution of hypervirulent pathogens. Mm-hmm. And so that we published a paper a couple of years ago that actually documented that happening within actually a bullfrog farm that was in Georgia, where you had two different strains coming together to create something that was twice as virulent as the two what are called sister strains coming together, or parent strains coming together.
And what about, is there... It's my understanding that there's scenarios where confinement can lead to amplification of diseases, but without an actual new variant necessarily meaning something with. I kind of got a little obsessed with parrot fever for a hot minute. This thing that took off in the early 1900s, but it was a disease that parrots, exotic birds would have. I out in the wild, and it wasn't really negatively impacting them that much until you stuck a ton of them in a crate together. And then it kind of amplified a disease that was already existing, but amplified it enough to make them asymptomatic, and then exacerbated the issue, and led to then spread to humans, which is how we became aware and cared about it. But are there kind of amplifying effects as well within the what was the contact rates?
Yeah. So in captivity, let's see, trying to figure the best way to answer your questions. Do you want to rephrase that just real quickly?
Sure. Can more confinement lead to amplification of viruses that a species is already kind of living with and managing? Like evolutionarily, there's been this stable system between the immune system and the host and virus or whatever. But now, because of these new conditions, the virus is able to amplify a lot quicker.
Yeah, so that happens in two different ways. One is that when you confine animals in high densities, it also creates stressful situations. So when we are stressed as humans, you're not sleeping much, etc. We produce these hormones, glucocorticoids, that actually suppress our immune system, and it's no different with other animals. And so what happens is, with a suppressed immune system, things that are around can then start to replicate and take over, and you become sick, right? And so the process of being stressed because of your surrounding environment is one thing. And then the other is what I kind of had talked about before, where when you have high contact rates, you increase the probability of transmission. And if you're transmitting and you're having, lots of pathogen replication going on, you increase the likelihood of it evolving into something that's hypervirulent. There's some epidemiological research that says or shows that if you have unlimited number of hosts that you can contact and infect, that your virulence, your ability to transmit, your ability to even kill the host will go up, because there's no cost except I can keep producing more. And so there's, by jamming things into a small area, stressing them out, there are two things that actually can result in, two mechanisms that can result in hypervirulent things occurring, or outbreaks, or which, when you talk about amplification, just producing more of the pathogen into the environment.
Yeah. And so what about what can be done in terms of, as we just become kind of more aware of this stuff? I imagine if you're if you're some governor in whatever state, and like all the issues going on, probably you hear about some issue with bullfrogs or something like that. You're like, I got enough on my plate. I don't need to address bullfrogs right now. How do we increase awareness? And because a lot of these things are just exist. So much of science, the average person just never has to hear about or deal with, is just running on in the background. Most of the food that we get from the grocery store, we don't have to think about the amount of biosecurity measures that have taken place to make sure that viruses don't take off when we're grouping a bunch of cows or chickens together or whatever else, and the number of processes and regulatory factors that keep us from eating diseased food. What sort of things would you like to see extended more toward protecting ecological environments and some of the wildlife trade of amphibians and that sort of, in terms of needing like a animal health certificate and stuff like that? What would you like to see implemented?
Yeah, I mean, what is really desperately needed is some sort of clean trade program. And so that exists, like I said, with domesticated animals, but it doesn't with wildlife. So some sort of standards or requirements that help promote or require that animals that are traded are negative for pathogens that are known of conservation concern. And right now with amphibians, that would be the two chytrid fungi and ranavirus. I had mentioned the World Organization for Animal Health. Their job is to really look at pathogens and list them with respect to their potential effects on industry, on wildlife populations, et cetera. And then if they're listed, which BD, BSAL, and ranavirus are listed, they're called notifiable. There's no regulatory thing connected with them, unfortunately, because they're wildlife pathogens, but listing, you have to have a list to go from so that importers know what that would need to be tested. But you also need to have some sort of program to facilitate that. Programs of clean trade can run through either regulations, or so you have to do this or you'll be fined, or they can be done through a process of facilitation. And I think ultimately what would be ideal is some sort of program. And again, this is beyond just amphibians, but for wildlife, where it's a government supported program that would, number one, require the testing of imported animals, and then potentially periodic testing within the domestic trade industry that your population of animals is free of pathogens. And I think based on the surveys we've done, that a pathogen-free certification program, so you can certify your amphibians or your whatever wildlife as being pathogen-free, is number one, that businesses are willing to accept. They like the idea. Consumers have also indicated through our consumer surveys that they would be willing to pay more for a pathogen-free amphibian. And it makes sense, because if the wildlife that you're acquiring as a pet are free of pathogens, then they're not going to pass it on to your other amphibians in your aquaria, right, that could then ultimately die. But this also links directly to the conservation implications, because how these pathogens ultimately get from the wild across the world to an importer, to a distributor, to a breeder, to your house, right, goes all the way through that chain. How does it get to the environment is either somebody releases the animal, or the animal dies and they just toss it out in the environment, or they even discard the aquarium contents or water into the environment that could contain the pathogen. So there's 3 or 4 ways that pathogen release can occur. And then if that comes in contact with a suitable host, another amphibian, then that's where you get the transmission to a live animal, to another live animal that then can transmit to others. And we know this occurs. We're actually watching the emergence of the other chytrid fungus I mentioned, BSAL, occur through Europe right now. Mm-hmm. Move from the northern part of Europe all the way to the southern part of Europe, and it's not from there. It's from also Southeast Asia, and it was introduced very likely through the pet trade. We have cases of exotic amphibians that are living in wild populations now that occur in Florida, California, and other places where people they think they're doing a good thing. I don't want to take care of it, so I'm going to release it to the wild.
Mm-hmm.
So the way to really approach wildlife trade and the risk of pathogens moving with them, which, by the way, could be zoonotic as well in some wildlife species, so it could affect us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is through a program that is supported by the government that that requires and allows and supports the testing of animals, and then a certification process that helps increase the value of the animals. That this is a certified business that's pathogen free, or these are certified animals. And from our surveys, it sounds like consumers would be willing, at least for pet amphibian consumers, are willing to pay more to cover that cost. And so what that would look like, we don't know. That's the future discussions we need to have with the pet industry, but also with appropriate government officials.
Very cool. And what, as we close out, could you say a few words about the One Health Initiative? Just kind of tell new listeners what the One Health Initiative is, and kind of why it's kind of important to the discussion that we've been having.
Right. Yeah. So at the University of Tennessee, we started the One Health Initiative a couple of years ago. One Health is a concept that has been around for a couple decades, but it's really now just gaining traction within the field of biological sciences and medicine. And it is the idea that we are thinking about about health as a connected system, so that the health of humans is linked with the health of the environment, which is linked with the health of agricultural animals, and is linked with the health of wildlife, and that we need to think about these things as being interconnected. We already talked about lots of examples of humans potentially negatively affecting the health of wildlife through changes in the environment, moving pathogens around. But clearly, wildlife can negatively impact humans too, right? The whole COVID pandemic is a COVID. SARS-CoV-2 was evolved from bats. So we can see how, and there's lots of examples, how that interaction is important. And so monitoring the health of wildlife, the health of humans, the health of the environment, and domesticated agricultural animals is key. And ultimately, the goal is, if you were able to monitor and keep track of pathogens that are moving and among these those components, is that you could have a better alert system to detect where new pathogens evolved, or where you have spillover from one group, from like wildlife to humans, humans to wildlife, or domesticated animals. And it can help with response to disease outbreaks. It can help with track and trace. It can make us a more ready society. SARS-CoV-2 was, the worst pandemic, in 100 years, right? But as devastating as it has been to the global economy, to our lives, our personal lives, there's something else that's going to evolve. And very likely it's going to be more wicked.
Mm-hmm.
If most of your viewers have, I'm sure, heard of Ebola. Ebola has a 50% mortality rate.
Yeah.
What if it's a hemorrhagic disease?
Yeah.
All right. What if SARS-CoV-2 had a 50% mortality rate? And, not trying to scare your viewers at all.
No,
that's what viruses do.
Yeah.
They jump between hosts, between wildlife, domesticated animals, humans. They take these big jumps in evolution, and they acquire new ways of surviving themselves as pathogens that is at a much faster scale and rate then often we can respond, or our bodies can change, right? And so, really developing a system, a One Health system, a One Health network, which is really a global effort, is a way that we can try to be ahead of the curve. And so getting that system up and running from a university here to a state, to multiple states, to a country, to multiple countries is the ultimate goal. We're not even close there at the global scale, let alone at smaller, regional scales. It's the One Health initiative, something that's really just starting to get some traction. It'll be something that hopefully will develop and be implemented on a broad scale in the future.
Yeah, amazing. Because it's also if hosts help viruses and disease spread by not doing things to mitigate them, there's a lot of opportunity for more virulent diseases and viruses to take off as well, right? I mean, just one last question, because you sort of mentioned this before, and I know this is, I've heard some takes a little bit back and forth, but it seems the general understanding is that if something is really virulent, oftentimes it will kill off a host before it's able to spread. So sometimes things that are less virulent will have an easier time spreading. But if something's having an easy time spreading from host to host, there's no reason why a more virulent strain isn't going to take off just by the nature of wanting to replicate as fast as possible. Why not replicate more in a host body if that host is going to go spreading it to other hosts anyway? Why not favor that through selection?
Right. Yeah. So high transmissibility. We are the most connected species in the world, humans. It's, we've seen it. We saw Omicron go across the entire world in a matter of less than a month. That's how fast it can occur. So the evolution towards transmission and is one thing I get to transmit, but and virulence is a component of that. But the pathogenicity is the other component, which is so how much of virulence, how much of more virus can I put out, and how easily can I transmit? So Omicron was at least twice as transmissible as Delta, which was like twice as transmissible as the original SARS-CoV-2, right? And so we are seeing this evolution to faster transmissibility, but we're also seeing the pathogenicity decrease. The important thing, regardless of the evolution, the evolution of pathogens is going to occur at a rapid way, and often in ways that are very difficult to predict. We do have the toolkits to do disease management, to do disease intervention. And that's kind of the key about a One Health perspective, is to be able to put in different strategies, whether it's in wildlife, whether it's in livestock, whether environments, or in humans, that will help reduce that likelihood of transmission, of evolution, etc. And so we do have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We just need to coordinate those and implement those. We saw actually failures of that during the COVID outbreak in multiple ways, whether it was the lack of communication, the lack of coordination, and some of the messaging. So, anyways, that's what needs to improve. If anything, I think a One Health perspective will help response to emerging infectious diseases in the future, whether it's with humans or other animals. And so
Well, I'm excited to watch it grow. There's definitely a need for it, and so hopefully with that need will come more of a demand and more of a public awareness as well. So I appreciate you. Thanks for sharing so much, Matt Gray, and being such a good guest. And yeah, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Shane.
And thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you more next week. All right, I hope you enjoyed the show, everybody. Once again, the first Global Amphibian and Reptile Disease Conference is in Knoxville, August 4 through 10. More importantly to the rest of you, put in a few fun links in the description. If you're on YouTube, by the way, throw us a subscribe. You can go on. We included a link that Matt sent me about some pharmaceutical attributes of amphibian skin, and also a neat video on limb regeneration. So you might find that interesting. Coming up on the show, I actually have a bunch of episodes banked right now, so I'm not sure. I've done some COVID and misinformation stuff recently. I have some more of that coming up, so I'm spacing it out a little bit, and then I have several other things. Maybe next week, ayahuasca episode. Ooh, speaking of clickbait. But yeah, I'm kind of I just have to see, because I think 2 weeks from now, one of the episodes that I'm looking forward to, probably going to be the best episode of the entire year, is coming out. So next week's going to be a surprise. Just know that I have a bunch queued up, ready to go already. And if next week's episode comes out perhaps like a day late or something, my editor, Matt, is currently on a bit of a vacation, and so should still be out on time next Wednesday, but otherwise it will be out on Thursday or something like that. All right. Well, thanks for the support on Patreon. That's how we keep this show ad-free. If you haven't checked out the Patreon, please do. It helps me out a great deal. It's how I pay Matt, and I would love to be able to add more things to this show eventually as we have more funds. So those of you that listen all the way to the end, you are, of course, my favorites.